Good evening and welcome to tonight's Global Conversation on Literacy with Dr. David Kirkland. Some of you are frequent GCLR webinar participants, and it is good to see you again. For those of you joining us for the first time, welcome. We are glad you are with us tonight. Your moderators for this evening are Dr. Peggy Albers, Professor of Language and Literacy at Georgia State University in Atlanta, Georgia, USA, and me, Sarah Turnbull, a Language and Literacy doctoral student at Georgia State University. We also have Christy Pace, Dr. Dennis Odo, Tuba Angar Crowder, Aram Cho, Jin Jung, Jihei Shin, Mandy Sena, Myung-Eun Peng, and Juan Wang joining us. They are also doctoral students at Georgia State University and part of the GCLR research team. Global Conversations in Literacy Research consists of online interactive web seminars with the intent to circulate cutting-edge research in the fields of literacy and language arts. GCLR currently seeks volunteers for a study on the nature of technology-mediated interactions within literacy-focused web seminars. If you are willing to participate in a brief interview, please type your email address into the chat area and a research team member will contact you within a few days to schedule an appointment. The collected data will provide important information for understanding the nature of web seminars to share scholarship across the world. During tonight's web seminar, if you have any comments or questions, please type them into the chat box. Dr. Kirkland will address these at the end of his presentation. We would love to know where you are participating from in tonight's webinar, so please use the wand tool and click your location on the map. Also, feel free to type it in the chat area as well. Okay, great. It looks like we have participants from all over. David Kirkland is a best-selling author, activist, cultural critic, educator, researcher, and thinker. He is also an associate professor of English and urban education at New York University. He has spent the past decade analyzing the culture, language, and textbook groups of urban American youth, and has expertise in critical literacy, linguistic, and ethnographic research methods. He has received many awards for his groundbreaking work, including a Spencer Foundation Postdoctoral Fellowship Award, a Ford Foundation Postdoctoral Fellowship Award, an NCT Cultivating New Voices Fellowship Award, the 2006 AERA Division G Dissertation Award, and among many others. At this time, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. David Kirkland and his presentation entitled A Psalm of the Smoke, Critical Thoughts on the Literacies of Young Black Men. Let's give him a virtual round of applause.
Thank you. I want to thank everyone who has tuned in to this web seminar today to hear my thoughts, excuse me, hear my thoughts on Black males in literacy. I also want to thank my colleague, and now hopefully I can call her my friend, Peggy Albers, for the gracious invitation that she extended me. Without her invitation, I wouldn't be here. To her support crew, my mentors and colleagues, also thank you. I could not do this work without you. Today I'll read some, discuss points derived from years of research on Black males and literacy, and do my best to articulate ideas that might humanize our journeys of literacy and the understanding of people, particularly people who are too often forced on the social margins. I want to begin this conversation, our conversation, by reading a verse from a poem by W.E.B. Du Bois titled The Song of the Smoke. I am the smoke king. I am black. I am breathing Broken hearts I am sheathing, love life's darts, inspiration of iron times, wetting the toll of tolling crimes, shedding the blood of bloodless crimes, lurid luring mid the blue, toward towering toward the true. I am the smoke king, I am black. I found this poem many years ago in graduate school while pouring into textual fountains to understand what Stephen Kusser has called the many dimensions of literacy as practiced by black males. The verse of Du Bois's poem was like hip-hop to me, a topic I gained important respect and admiration for while also in grad school studying black males and literacy. However, the verse was more naked than hip-hop, more stripped of the bravado and pliant patriarchal escapades that invite scenes of exaggerated toughness. The poem was real like my own story, a story of literacy, which for Du Bois and other black men like him and me could read and write, though our words, our many words, have been masked by smoke in the structural basements of dismissal and too often ignored in the histories of poets and pages erased from the conversation of literacy by what I call racial magic. The song of the smoke spoke instead of a new perspective, that black people were people too, that black men could be literate, that they could be kings as opposed to criminals, that we, and I include myself because I am a black male, we write too about and with the sensitivities that make us all human. But when we look at the research, we find a single story hidden in the noise of smoke. The stats are clear, and they evoke a sense of terror. Nearly 70% of fourth grade boys read below grade level compared to 27% of white children. Even Hispanic and Asian fourth graders fare better on reading exams than black males, although English is their second language. We know too that black males are at the bottom or near the bottom of all academic achievement categories and are grossly overrepresented among school suspensions, dropouts, and special education tracks. Approximately 12% of black males test proficiently in reading compared to 40% of other American youth. And nearly 40% of black males will be jobless, either unemployed or incarcerated by 2020. The statistics become even more grim. We know too that young black men, ages 10 to 14, have shown the largest increase in suicide rates since 1980 compared to other youth groups by sex and ethnicity, increasing to 180%. And among black males, 15 to 19, suicide rates have increased by 80%. We know that suicide is the leading, not suicide but homicide is the leading cause of death among black males, 18 to 24. And to this point, a black male is twice as likely to die before the age of 45 as a white man. So what does this all mean? Like many others, I too took a deficit perspective on black males and literacy, and entered my work in literacy research wanting to find ways to fix, as opposed to understand, to unfortunately bridle instead of to build and to bridge beyond the so-called literacy and language gaps that left so many young black men behind. Back then, I too was wrong. So today I want to begin our conversation with another kind of question, one that doesn't suggest first that black men, like other youth, possess the human potential to bind words, to make meaning, to express self through complex symbiologies, and to use language, spoken, written, and ascribed, to participate in value, cultural, and social activities for meaning-making purposes. Instead of asking how to change it, I set out over a decade ago, asking how we might understand them. How are they literate when they are literate? And why are they literate when they do choose to participate in this thing we call literacy? We have tried hard to understand the topic of black males and literacy, though from what seems like a blurry lens, a lens that only that not only distorts our knowledge of him, but also distorts our knowledge of literacy and our ability to work with him in classrooms across the nation. My research suggests that this misunderstanding has had dangerous consequences for Black males sitting in classrooms across the country. I want to share a case. And before sharing the case, I want to lay out what this talk will do. My first objective in sharing the case will be to raise awareness of the conditions of young Black men in contemporary society. My second objective will be to provide then a humanizing narrative of what young Black men, that illustrates his sensitivities and intimacies, those things that shapes his ways with words, to provide suggestions for effectively engaging young Black men in a transformative project of education on his terms, as opposed to some prescribed terms for social healing and for what I call social justice. I begin with a research participant who was given an assignment in a classroom. The teacher, wanting to engage her Black male students, gave this assignment to Derek, and she said to the class, write a story about yourself. And you can use whatever genre you want. Because her Black males, like many Black males in classrooms across the country, was not writing. And so Derek, when given an opportunity to write, and write in a way that made sense to him, wrote this poem. U-turn, left behind, legs sprawling on top of black-back mountains, rivers that run deep like Sheba's queens, and she loves open pores inside empty cups that run over. Hope like escalades that faint in darkness, that freeze and night, that frickin' morning uprising, light-skinned white men, blues is my brothers, black is my berry, sweet is my juice, so you turn back to me, I return back to you, I dive in before you. After receiving the poem, the teacher did this. She struck through the youth. She told him that his use of sprawling was broken English, that he needed to use correctly. She corrected his use of the term pores. She told him to spell the term light out. She told him that he used the term you wrong. She also told him that he was lazy, that he needed to spell things like for and you out. But the thing that she didn't do, she didn't talk to Derek. She didn't ask him about his literacy. She didn't ask him about his ways with words. She didn't ask him about why he wrote the way he did right. Had she asked him, she would have got a different response. And perhaps her response to his poem would have been different. Here we begin to understand the literacies of Black males. According to Derek, he says it's like, to tell my story, you need a new set of words. Like the language I got ain't good enough by itself to say who I am. You can't talk about everything talking correct. You know, I give my poems an accent. That accent gives my poems an essence. You see what I'm saying? So I can use familiar sounds like freeze, but when I spell it, I'm on some other stuff. I'm talking about something different. Yeah, I'm telling a different story. And here we see that Derek understands something about his language and something about the uses of his language. Even though the teacher considered his language use incorrect, he understood the appropriateness of the language use. He understood that language itself was rooted in place. He says, we get our language from where we at. Right now I'm in hip hop. The language I speak is called rap. I rap. So hip hop is going to affect the way I talk, the way I write, everything. And I don't think he was wrong, because linguists of African American language have long argued that language and context have a relationship, that speakers of language are rooted within that context, that learning or acquisition of language is contextualized. Take, for instance, Smitherman's definition of semantic inversion. She writes, one of the least understood communicative practices of African American language is the manipulation of European American English's semantic structure. Often inappropriately dismissed as black slang, this rhetorical maneuvering amounts to linguistic appropriation, what late linguist Grace Holt called semantic inversion. It is a process whereby African American language speakers take words and concepts from European American English's lexicon and either reverse their meanings or impose entirely different meanings. Derek wasn't a linguist, but he understood the rules of the game. He understood how his language worked. And within that language, he was able to write in ways that were meaningful to him, using new words to evoke complex meanings that he wanted to communicate. Here he says, these words ain't new, but they are new when I use them like this because to me they can mean different things. It's like the difference between fat and fat. Fat spelled with an F means big, like out of shape. Fat spelled with a PH means it ain't out of shape. It's nice. I use the PH in the poem to make old words mean new things. Fake don't mean to fall out, it means to get away from. To fall below the radar screen of everybody, but you're still operating correctly. Your game is still on point. But you just ain't putting it out there for everybody to know because everybody ain't got your back. Freeze don't mean to be cold, it means to get free, to move quietly away from what haunts you. Derek had complex explanations for how he wrote. His literacy came from a place rooted not only in the environments of his interest, but also in his cultural history, in his background. Of course, his literacy was written in the language of place where he came from, in hip-hop, in African American linguistics, what Samuel Lim is called hip-hop linguistics. It was part and parcel in some ways of who he was and who he was becoming, extending words through this thing that Smitherman has called semantic inversion. So I asked, why didn't the teacher see the value, both the anthropological and sociolinguistic, the scientific as well as the intellectual academic value in Derek's poem? Let us consider, through the linguistic Marxist lens, what actually happened in the interaction between the teacher and what I would consider her educational violence against this young man's poem, and Derek in his explanation of the complexity that was latent in his poem. From a linguistic Marxist perspective, we know that language can be used and is used as a social and cultural political currency for the exchange of values, beliefs, and dispositions. But we also know that language is essentially part of who we are. And here we see that some languages are valued more than others. Therefore, certain individuals are perceived to have greater worth than others. Certain values can be useful in school, whereas others get red marked. We also see that the value of language is constantly shifting, amended by the elite to reflect them, their languages, their interests, their values, their determinations. And when we consider this politics of language, we get to other considerations like hegemony. The success of, some dominant group, in this sense, a dominant language in projecting its values, dispositions, interests, its forms, whereby the masses are made to consent to multiple forms of oppression. And here we know that multiple forms of oppression are silences or erasures, fears and hatreds of self and others, feelings of inferiority and superiority, entitlement and disentitlement. And these things feed into what I call benign ideologies, missionary models, saving black males instead of understanding them, fixing them, instead of researching them in ways that might understand and capture the subjective agencies that they bring into the linguistic and literate equation and deficit theories. The constant running idea that black males only can be told from one literate story, and that is a story that they lack literacy, that they lack the dominant literacy, which in some of the imagination, the pedagogical imagination throughout the nation, and certainly in Derek's teachers' imagination, was the case. And these deficit theories work as such. And I want to talk about this because I think it's important to understand Black males and literacy, because much of the science on Black males and literacy and the statistics that I shared earlier, we see them from a deficit perspective. Yet it doesn't match up with all understandings, at least my understanding of Black males and literacy. A deficit perspective works like this. We see young men not reading and writing in our classrooms, and we assume that they do not read and write. As a result, we label them disengaged readers or disengaged writers because they are not responsive to a standardized language or literary canon. But when I ventured outside of the classroom with Derek, when I asked Derek a question about, what his writing meant, he was able to give me not only supple, but subtle explanation of his literacy and his literacy practices. It wasn't that Derek was a disengaged writer or a disengaged reader. It wasn't that he was illiterate. It's that the classroom was disengaging, or the canon was disengaging, the assignment was disengaging, the language that he was made to write into was disengaging. It wasn't Derek who was disengaged. It was our imaginations around Derek in the classroom that was disengaging. We have research to support a different perspective on Black males and literacy. According to Connor, youth of promise, particularly Black males, have long engaged in learning and literacy practices. These processes tend to gain meaning in youth circles, social circles, not in classrooms, but particularly in the cultures of hip-hop and sports, and the symbol systems that they use beyond the classroom. And when we invite these things in, sanction urban poetry and spoken word, as well as tattoos and tags and raps, all are artifacts of Black males and literacy, all of which are communicative genres rooted in the Black world tradition of tonal semantics, narrativizing signification or signifying the dozens, Africanized syntax, and other communicative practices that are richly consistent with what we know about Black males' expressions of literacy. And because of what she sees as a teeming life of literacy among these youth of promise, Dyson suggests that the literacy gap is an aberration that reflects more accurately the cultural derisions of society rather than achievement ones. Let me say that again. So the statistics that I showed before of Black males being illiterate does not reflect necessarily their literacy ability or their rates of literacy. Rather, it might reflect cultural derision in society as opposed to achievement ones. Had the teacher worked from a profit perspective, a perspective that insists upon what readers and writers can do as opposed to what they cannot do, what they possess as opposed to what they lack, the teacher may have found something else in the poem. The you in the poem. She may have found work in ways that my colleague Django Paris has called idiom. A symbol actually showing the term. She would have found in the poem allusions to African American literature. The Negro speaks of rivers, rivers that run deep. Or to the Holy Bible, Sheba's queens and open pores inside empty cups that run over. To desired things like big cars, escalators. To popular culture, where white and Black men write from. Things like Blues Brothers or Blackberries. But most of all, she would have found the story, a narrative of a young man who, lost his lover and found the grace to return, or of a young man who lost his God and found redemption in returning. And she talked to him. Had she understood deeply the ways that his language moves work, the ways that, his appropriations of his cultural heritage work, the ways that black male literacy worked, and not only the ways that he was writing, but the whys that he would write and the hows that he would write, I wonder if her pen would have been differently. Because if we study literacy only from the perspective of the hegemonic elite, if we study literacy from the monocultural centers of hegemony and dominance, if we explore it to the exclusion of what young men like Derek do, we only get what they can't do or what they don't do. We leave teachers like the teacher Derek had only with a red pen to strike through the differences that are both cultural and social that show up in the ways that he will read and he will write. Here we understand that the study of literacy is incomplete until it folds together the doing and the being, the struggle and the sacrifice, unless the story of literacy becomes the story of us, all of us, the literate, black males included. Unless we ask, how does she or he come to be whoever and whatever she or he is? What stories are invited in the life of being that finds their way through the pen and through the creases of words practice? That's what researching black males and literacy is about. It can't be about the stale statistics that continue to fuel this idea that black males and literacy is in crisis. It can't only be about what these young men can't do when they sit in our classrooms not reading and writing. It can't be about painting deficits about their languages, why they spell words wrong. It has to be about why they spell the way they spell when they do spell. It has to be about them. And here, we're called to write and to merge our research, as I have, within what I call the pedagogical third space. And it's an overlapping space that respects the diverse worlds that youth transit. And in this conceptualization, those transitory spaces are optimal. They crisscross, they intersect, they blend, and they bleed. And we understand their literacy practice is not from a place of dominant space, but instead from a place from the places that they exist and the places that we want them to go. With that said, I want to clear the smoke by sharing 5 closing thoughts about black males and literacy. My first thought, and echoing some of the sentiments that I've made previously, the study of literacy must move beyond questions of what and toward questions of whos and whys and hows. We know what literacies young black men practice and how to bridge those literacies to literacies that extend far beyond them. We know these things. We have years of research that have illustrated and have given us a volume, a litany of artifacts, a list of things. Now we need to understand, how are they literate? How are they literate in their ciphers and in the shadows of our classrooms? Why are they literate? Why do they choose to read when they do choose to read, for instance? And why also do they choose not to read when they choose not to read? And asking the question and begging the question, the whys, the hows, the whens. This will require that we rethink the basics. They're not reading, writing, and arithmetic. They're things like pleasure and play, curiosity and creativity. Before I became a reader, I first learned to love reading. I was given opportunities to play with words, to ask questions, to be creative with those words. These things are the foundations of literacy. And yet when we study Black males, too often the topics, the foundations are too distorted. We don't start with a place of pleasure and curiosity and play. Again, we start with those deficits. What do they like and why do they like them? Thought number 3, we have to rethink the classroom. Black males learn in spaces that are not always fitted between the walls that we teach in. Sometimes the spaces are more open, and other times the spaces are more compressed. Have to be willing and daring to go there. And thought number 4, we have to interrogate assumptions about the status quo. Instead of talking about failing Black males, let's think about how we are failing Black males. Instead of framing them within the literacy crisis, let's think about ways that we, all people, create literacy. And finally, let's research and teach like our lives depend on it. Because too often theirs, and I have to include myself, ours do. I want to thank you. Thank you. And I think at this point, I'll answer questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Kirkland, for your insightful and engaging presentation. We will now invite Dr. Kirkland to respond to the questions that you have generated across the presentation. Please continue to type in your questions in this Q&A session facilitated by Dr. Albers.
Thanks so much, Dr. Kirkland. That was a really inspiring talk. We really appreciate your thoughts about the education of African American youth. The chat generated a lot of questions tonight, and really interesting questions. And so I'd like to start with one question. It has to do with high stakes assessments, and there were several comments and questions around that. 2 of our viewers asked, high stakes assessments keep us focused on how to help our students, quote unquote, succeed on a measure that draws our attention from what we know and what they can do. But the other, in response to that, another viewer said, are standards at the heart of this issue? The idea that there is a universal body of knowledge and skill that everyone should master. The idea that you should be able to measure objectives, set objectives, and assess objectives. I guess the question really is about, will you talk a little bit about the role of high stakes assessment and your talk, in particular about Derek and his use of language?
Yeah, so I want to answer that question in 3 ways. And I think it's an important question to ask, especially in this culture and atmosphere, climate of standardization, and accountability. The first answer that I have to the question is, if we continue down the road, if we continue doing what we've been doing, the ways that we've been doing it, will that change anything? Will continuing to enforce what we would consider standardized literacy practices, the dominant or hegemonic literacies on Black males, will that increase their literacy scores? We have some evidence to suggest that it might, but the overwhelming evidence, and I gave some of it at the beginning of this talk, is that it won't. And so what we've been doing in this conversation is, instead of changing the ways that we engage Black males in learning, we double down on ways that do not work and have not worked with them. Einstein says that a fool is a person who tries something that doesn't work and continues to try it. I think it's time for us to be less foolish because we're very smart people and dare to consider other ways. Literacy is a social and cultural practice. And when we engage it as a social and cultural practice, when we build and understand deeply the ways that literacy is connected not only to the identities, but to the deep sociologies of individuals, we become more effective. Where Latson-Billings has talked about culturally relevant pedagogy, Jingle Paris talks about culturally sustaining pedagogy, and I think they do so for a reason, because we have a class of people in the United States, when they receive literacy pedagogy, they receive a culturally relevant education. And those students succeed. We've seen the test scores. But the students who are not able to learn literacy in ways that are attached to and build and bridge from their cultural background and cultural histories, those students suffer. Those students struggle. So my first answer to the question, we have to dare to be more creative. Now is the time to choose another track, to choose another way. Because education, literacy education, for many of these young men, and I've borne witness to it, and my book, A Search Past Silence, is very much an issue of, prison, life or death. So we have to make a change. The other question that I have is, for the audience, let us intellectually entertain this notion of standards. The best to understand it as the term standard before it came to mean, something that we so appreciate, meant, a flag, right? And so we get the standard bearer in war. But before it meant the flag, it actually stood for the army, the phalanx, the troop, who were supposed to be of one mind, of one movement, because it was important in battle that soldiers were stripped of some type of autonomy and that they would work toward a common goal, that they would be one thing. So the term standard is this interesting military metaphor that we've applied to education as if it's desirable. One question that I would have for the audience is that term standard a desirable metaphor? Is it something that we want? Or can we want something different? Principles of education. Principles that suggest that we can build upon, and that we can enhance, that we can preserve, that we can root literacy in the cultural backgrounds of individuals, and from that rootedness begin to culturally extend how people use language and use words. It's quite a different conversation. And I'm not saying that we don't have an education, that we don't have a science of literacy that appreciates, that desires to extend, that desires some sort of, beautiful development and growth. What I'm saying is the calculus that we are using now, the equations that we have for achieving that aren't working. And we have good science now that suggests, or that gives us some theory, some explanation of why it's not working. And so maybe we need a new pathway, a new trajectory toward building, literate individuals, particularly young Black men, who can achieve. So that's my long answer, to that very sage question. Thank you, Peggy.
That was really lovely. I think standards certainly they're certainly loaded. There's no doubt about it. I'm going to ask a follow-up question that one of the participants asked, and this participant says, it seems so daunting to try to quote-unquote change the system. In what ways can we retrain teachers of today who are full of the right way to write to see the value of different dialects of all people groups?
I think that's another good question. But I don't think that we have to give up changing the system. I think the system desires that we change it. I think the democracy that the forefathers of this country and the foremothers, who have made the country better, they talked about, they wrote about, they insisted upon change. The whole idea of perfecting our union, suggests a process of ongoing development. David, Cuban and Larry Cuban and David Tyeck's book, Tinkering Toward Utopia, suggests too in the history of education that education, gets better when we dare to tinker with it, or we dare to radically change it. So I wouldn't give up, in trying to change education, to invite, some type of system or some types of systems that will incorporate, and work well with all youth, because I think we can do it. I'm optimistic. But in terms of preparing teachers, I think that's another important conversation, because the teacher that we saw in the talk that I just gave, she wasn't a poorly intentioned teacher. She wasn't a bad teacher. I personally knew her. I became, quite fond of her and her commitment to her students, that she would have me come into her classroom, and research a set of young men, is, I believe, evidence of that she would ask me, how can I do better with, the students is evidence of that. But there's something about her education. It was something about the expectations of her that led her to do a particular type of, a particular type of teaching. There's something that led her to read Derrick's poem in the way that she did read Derrick's poem. And so I think her teacher education is implicated. I think we have to do a better job of helping teachers become more sensitive, to the needs of their students. I've been doing research on, vocabulary programs. There are like 5 big vocabulary programs, and all of them have research behind them. All of these vocabulary programs say that they work. They say that they work. They say that if you use this program, your students will learn words. And yet, we have students, right? If the vocabulary programs got 5 that say that they work, that they can work with students, that students will learn words, yet we have students inside of our country who still, according to some research, lack words. This either means that the people who are doing the vocabulary research lied to us, and the vocabulary programs don't work, or it means that, something else is going on. And my argument is something else is going on. We know how to teach reading. We know how to teach writing. We got programs for that. And those programs have research behind them that suggests that they work. Yet we see constantly that these programs work better with some youth than they do with others. The question isn't about, when we talk about literacy, isn't about new programs. It's not about phonemic awareness. It's not about vocabulary deficits or vocabulary gaps. It's about how well we can get students to understand the students who sit in the seats before them. Because it's about the individual relationships. It's about understanding, the language and the deep, literacies and the practices of each individual, so that teachers can be nimble and flexible enough to begin to shape experiences that each student, that can effectively work with each student. That's what it's about. And so I'm arguing that we need that type of, training for teachers, but in order for teachers to get that type of training, we need more research, that's going to get into the lives of the lives of their students, the lives of our students, our research participants. We're going to need stories so that teachers can understand outside the single narrative, the crisis narrative, that young Black men, for instance, aren't just problems, aren't just lacking literacy, aren't just things that need to be fixed, but are humans that instead need to be understood. And so in implicating teacher education, I think I have to implicate, researchers, myself included, that we need to begin to conduct and do, not just different types of research, but those deep brands of research that's going to take us, not only into the heads, but also into the hearts and into the homes, students that we too often mislabel. And then we need to share that research in deep conversations with teachers, so when they receive or get a Derrick enrolled in their classrooms, they'll understand, where this kid comes from. And they'll understand how, how to shape experiences that will build from where that kid comes from to where they want that kid to be.
That's really, that's really very powerful. We have a question that's interesting. We know that your scholarship is around African American youth, especially African American males. And one question says, or one participant asks, the question that comes to my mind is, why do you believe that black males are more affected by the traditional classroom and black females are not?
Well, in my research, I don't typically, pit black men against black women, and I do that for a reason. I think it's important. I think that black males aren't the only students, who are in some ways tragic victims of an education system that's not made for them. And when I say an education system not made for them, again, I'm evoking the work of Hayek and Cuban, who argues when American education was made, women and people in color, weren't necessarily, considered. We've evolved in some ways, but in other ways we've held steadfast to, a history of education that privileges some and certainly marginalizes others. So I wouldn't say that, in my conversation, or at least my focus on, black males, that black females, that we don't need more work on black females. I think more work needs to be done with black females and in ways to understand their literacies. And I think that's important work that needs to be done. In the book, A Search Past Silence, I actually use what I call a hip-hop feminist perspective, feminist spelled with a PH, organic feminism, to read black males, because a lot of what, I experienced in understanding literacy in the lives of black males was in relationship to the young women and older women in their lives. Women who would hand them books, women, who would, teach them how to read, teach them how to write, women who were also in conversation with them, and women who certainly shared, in their, social struggles, as well as had their own social struggles. So to answer that question, I think it's important, to appreciate, all people, across multiple lines of difference. And by evoking, one group, I think it's important to say that we don't necessarily, it's not intended, that some other group has it better off, and we live in a world where, multiple oppressions, exist, and this isn't a competition, so my work in looking at black males and literacy certainly isn't to the exclusion of, a need to look at, black females in literacy, or Latinos, both male and females in literacy, or Asians in literacy, and dare I say whites in literacy. Vicky Purcell Gates writes about, Appalachian, the Appalachian, which you would consider a literacy crisis. I would call it a literacy difference, so I think that there's room to understand this equation larger. I think my point is that we have to be more surgical in our understandings of literacy, that we have to begin to take social identity, in the various intersections of social identities into consideration, and begin to scale our literacy studies, with these in mind, begin to script narratives that will help not only the field to understand more deeply, the nuances of literacy practice, but also the nuances and behaviors of particular groups, as they, add to, the human performance or practice, of literacy. Not sure if I answered your question, but, I do want to make it clear. I want to make it very clear that, and by no means does my work suggest, or do I want to suggest with my work, that we don't need more work with other groups, particularly African American females or black females.
Yes, I agree, and I think part of it too is that you can only do so much research too, right? It's something that you're specializing in, so I think that we need to certainly understand that part too. One of our participants was interested in the model that you put up, and the participant asked, it's about the assumption that young black males are necessarily more distanced from the official curricula. This participant wanted you to say a little bit more on this. What practices in particular distance young black men, and what practices might close up that distance?
That's a beautiful question, and I think the implicit critique in the question is sage, and I do want to attend to it. And again, I'm not saying that black males are more distant than the official curriculum. But what I am saying is that there are, spaces where the home lives of people, Black males included, overlap and, diverge from, what happens in school. The extent to which we teach within that overlap, will give us an opportunity to build from the home spaces or the out of school spaces, and I'm evoking the work of people like Glenda Hall and her colleagues, and what we want, students to do in school. It's very Vygotskian in some ways, even though Homi Bhabha, talked about third space in his book, Location of Culture in 1992, and of course my colleague Chris Gutierrez, has been talking about pedagogical third spaces for some years now. I can recall her piece, in 2008. So when evoking the conceptual construct, it's not, exclusive to Black males first. There's going to be third spaces or opportunities to teach within a pedagogical third space for all students. There's going to be some overlap, between what happens in school and what happens outside of school. And the argument here is that space of convergence is important for us to teach in. There's also going to be some dissonance from, what happens in school and what happens outside of school. And when we occupy the space of dissonance, by branding, official pedagogies outside of the intersection of what happens outside of schools, I think I'm arguing that we can do educational damage to students, Black males included. I think too, I need to say for Black males and other students, certainly not all Black males, because I don't want to centralize us. I think that's a problem too, and too often we see in the research a centralized narratives of Black males. But for too many Black males, the distance between home and school is often great. It's kind of like code switching. The conversation on code switching usually goes like this, that everyone code switches, and when you come to school, you speak the language that's appropriate to the school context. You leave your home language at the door. But the problem is that, and we know from the work of Shirley Bryce Heath and others, is that, schools sometimes mirror more closely the practices of some communities than they do to others, which means that there's a political distance, that some people code switch, or the distance of switching is greater than others. So in my third space calculation, the overlap between school and Black males, while an overlap between all students exists, the overlap between schools and Black males may be greater because schools might match other communities more than it matches the communities that many of our Black males come from, and many of our Black males practice literacy within. And so the short answer to the question is, yes, there's going to be third space with every student, but what we know both from the research and from, from the theories around third space is that, some people are, disproportionately affected, by third space, meaning there's less overlap, between school and home with some communities and some groups than there is with others.
Thank you. We have time for just one more question, and that's from one of our participants that says, what is your narrative? And basically, can you talk a little bit about where you see the direction of research in terms of African American youth and how it might shift from a more conventional approach to something that looks a little bit more like Derek's?
Okay, yes. So my narrative is I was a high school English teacher. It was the reason I smiled when that question was asked. I was going to actually share, and I usually do when I do talks like this, and I talk about my work. I try to humanize it, with a reading of a few pages from my autobiography. I didn't today for the sake of time, and I wanted to engage questions. But I taught, English in the Michigan area for, several years, a little bit more than half a decade. And I also, come from Detroit, Michigan. You know, I tell the story about being raised in a brothel, you know, being homeless for a year, you know, having teachers who were able to help me and connect me to rich things. I met Geneva Smitherman, you know, many years ago. Before I met her, I believe, like many African Americans, that I didn't have a language. She told me I did have a language, and it changed the game for me. And a lot of my research comes from that personal place of narrative. To the second question, you know, where do we need to go in terms of further directions? Kim Crenshaw, a lawyer as well as a critical race theorist, she uses this concept from critical race theory called intersectionality. And I believe the research around literacy, you know, has to move into that place where we're taking up this topic, this construct of intersectionality, which means that we have to do intersectional research. People embody a variety of identities, right? Homosexual, socioeconomic identities, cultural identities, linguistic identities, age identities, ability identities, and all of these identities intersect, and they give us different narratives. Chimamanda Adichie, she writes about the danger of a single story. So if we only take, you know, one identity instead of the intersectional identities, we only get the single story. And every time we get the single story, we get something that's incomplete. Adichie says the danger of a single story, you know, it's the danger of the stereotype. And she argues that the problem with stereotypes is not that they're incorrect, it's that they're incomplete. The problem with literacy studies, when it does not move into the complexity of our intersectional identities, is not that it's, you know, incorrect, it's that it's incomplete. Now it's time for us to complete the narrative. And so I think that, you know, conceptual ideas, you know, like, you know, multiple narrative and, you know, moving into the multiple narrations of, you know, literacy, meaning that all literacy isn't hegemonic, middle-class, white literacy, where, you know, many of our understandings of literacy have come from, meaning we need to do that work of creating complex and textured narratives around what we have as a understanding of literacy. So we need multiple stories, but we also need within those multiple stories ways to begin to articulate, narrate, and explain the complex identities, the intersectionalities, you know, that give us literacies. So if James G. is right, if literacy is tied to identity, then we need to extend that understanding of literacy as being tied to identities, or literacy as an identities kit. And once we understand literacy as identities, that means that we have a lot more work to do, complicated work to do in fashioning an understanding around literacy, intersectionality, and multiple narratives for multiple stories.
That's a beautiful way to end this Q&A. It's a real call for teachers and students and researchers alike who have attended this session to think about the stories that their students and the people with whom they work, the stories that they bring to the classroom. So we want to thank you, Dr. Kirkland, for your very inspiring and very insightful conversation and talk tonight. And it's at this point that I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Turnbull, our host.
Thank you.